My name is Sure. And I can tell you the exact second a family stops being what you thought it was. There's no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic explosion. It ends quietly, like a candle dying out while everyone pretends the room is still lit. That evening we were all gathered around my parents' old dining table, the one that had witnessed decades of birthdays, arguments, and false reconciliations. The lighting was warm, the meal smelled familiar, but the atmosphere felt staged, like everyone was reading lines from a script they'd rehearsed for years. My sister looked up with a smile that never touched her eyes. She leaned back, studied me with the detached curiosity one might reserve for an object, and delivered the sentence that rearranged everything I believed about belonging in that house. Mom and Dad said you're basically the help. She said it casually, playful even, as though she already knew the punchline and wanted to watch the impact land. My mother paused her fork just long enough for a small, triumphant smile to appear. My father didn't look at me, he simply let out a quiet laugh that confirmed the truth. No one corrected her. No one objected. They all continued eating as though I weren't sitting at the same table, as though I had never been anything more than a convenience. I didn't argue. I didn't ask how long they'd been calling me that behind my back. I simply stood, placed my napkin down with steady hands, and walked out of the home I once believed I belonged to. A week later, my phone lit up with a message from my mother. The mortgage payment is overdue. That was all. No greeting, no concern, just another expectation. If you want to know what followed, how I stepped away from the role they carved for me and what it cost, then stay. Because the story didn't end the night I walked out. That night was just where it began. The air was cold when I drove away, the heater blasting, yet the chill inside me refused to fade. The road ahead was silent. No music, no phone calls, not even tears, just a steady pressure in my chest, like something inside had finally fractured in a way that couldn't be undone. I kept my grip firm on the steering wheel, afraid that if my hands shook, the rest of me would collapse. The town looked familiar, yet heavier, like every memory had gained weight. Eventually, I stopped in front of my Aunt Marlene's house, my father's older sister, a quiet woman who had spent her life avoiding unnecessary noise. Her porch light was on, not for me specifically, but because she kept it lit for anyone who might need it. I knocked once. She opened the door almost immediately. She didn't ask a single question. She didn't search my face for explanations or force me to speak before I was ready. She simply stepped aside and let me enter a kind of warmth that didn't require repayment. Marlene moved through her home with slow, practiced motions. She rested a hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture that said she understood more than words could express. She boiled water for tea and added honey with the ease of someone who knew how to offer comfort without ceremony. The room felt grounded, not soft or sentimental, just honest. She arranged blankets on the sofa and told me I could stay as long as I needed. Her voice was gentle but carried the firm certainty of a woman who had seen storms arrive quietly and leave slowly. We sat in the dimly lit living room while steam curled from our cups. Marlene studied me without intruding, giving me space to breathe. After a long silence, she finally spoke. She told me she had always sensed that my childhood home didn't know how to hold its children. Her words were careful but precise, landing with the weight of truth rather than accusation. She said I had been treated like my value came only from what I could do, not who I was. Some families build love from presence, she said softly, and others build control from dependence. I listened. The truth didn't hurt, it had already hurt a week earlier at that dinner table. Marlene didn't try to soften anything, she simply named what had existed for years. She said leaving wasn't betrayal. It was survival. She said sometimes the first act of real loyalty is to yourself. Something inside me uncoiled. Not relief. Not triumph. Just the beginning of a boundary. I told her I would not return. The words came steady, without shame or hesitation. She nodded, unsurprised, and told me I deserved a life where my presence wasn't a service, where my existence wasn't reduced to function. I believed her because she wasn't lecturing, she was recognizing something I had never been allowed to see. That night, wrapped in her blankets, I listened to the quiet hum of the house. It wasn't silent the way my parents' house was. This silence allowed space for breathing. I stared at the ceiling, understanding that something had ended, not just a moment or a conversation, but something old, something I had been holding together long after it had stopped holding me. I didn't cry. I simply let the stillness settle. The week that followed moved slowly. Mornings became rituals, watering Marlene's garden, brewing coffee in her old metal pot, sitting by the window as sunlight softened the space around me. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was exactly what felt strange. I had lived for so long in constant tension that stillness felt foreign. I washed dishes, folded blankets, walked to the small corner store, ordinary tasks that reminded me I could exist without being judged or evaluated. Marlene continued her routines with a calm steadiness that anchored the house. She never asked how long I would stay. She never hinted at inconvenience. She simply made room for me. One afternoon, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, my mother again. The timing was predictable, perfectly calculated to appear concerned rather than demanding. Her message read, "The mortgage is overdue. I assume you'll pay it today." The entitlement in her words was familiar. Bitterly familiar. There was no question, only expectation, like she was assigning me a task I had somehow agreed to perform forever. I held the phone for a moment, then typed my response with calm clarity, "I'm not paying anymore." I hit send. No hesitation. No shaking hands. No guilt. I placed the phone face down and didn't bother pacing or overthinking it. The message was final because I no longer needed permission to end something that had been draining me for years. Several minutes later, the phone vibrated again. My mother's tone. Her tone had shifted, not sharply, but in a way that tried to disguise itself as concern. She wrote, "Sweetheart, your sister is having a rough time. Families are supposed to stand together. You've always been the dependable one." The words were wrapped in gentleness, yet beneath them was an unmistakable thread of blame. The message suggested that by stepping away, I was failing them rather than protecting myself. I didn't answer. My silence was deliberate. The stillness I had been practicing had become a boundary I could finally hold. I knew that replying would only pull me back into the pattern I had repeated for years, explaining, justifying, absorbing guilt so others wouldn't have to face their own choices. I refused to return to that version of myself. That evening, Marlene and I sat again in the quiet of her living room. She knitted slowly while I read an old book I'd taken from her shelf. The silence between us didn't feel heavy anymore, it felt deserved. After a few minutes she lifted her eyes from her knitting and said, "You look steadier today." There was no question in her voice, only recognition. I nodded because I understood exactly what she meant. The clarity came from the simple truth that I no longer needed to bargain for a place in my own family. Before I went to bed, I checked my phone. Several new messages from Mom waited on the screen. The tone had shifted completely now, from soft disappointment to pointed guilt. She wrote about obligation, about how families make sacrifices, about how I had always been the responsible one who held everything together. Not once did she ask how I felt. Not once did she ask if I was all right. The messages spoke of family values, yet none of them treated me as a person. I turned the phone off. The silence stayed with me, but it didn't echo. It supported me. That weekend the house felt calm in a way that allowed even the faintest noises to surface, the ticking of the wall clock, the slight rustle of the curtains when the heater turned on. I sat at the dining table while Marlene sorted through a faded folder she had pulled from her bedroom drawer. The edges were worn, as though it had been opened countless times. She spread the papers out neatly, receipts for repairs, utility bills, grocery lists, medical payments, car insurance renewals, even tuition receipts from when Paula spent a year at community college. Every document carried my name somewhere on it, either handwritten, signed, or printed as the payer. The truth formed quietly but unmistakably across the table. I had been financially sustaining the household far longer than I had ever allowed myself to fully acknowledge. Marlene spoke gently, with the kind of steady tone that never pushed. She said that people often reshape their memories to avoid feeling guilty, and that families tend to rely on the person who never complains. She wasn't criticizing my parents or Paula, she was simply naming what had grown slowly and silently over time. The realization landed softly. It didn't crush me, it clarified everything. Then Marlene suggested that I consider creating financial separation. Not out of bitterness, but as a step toward living responsibly and independently. She offered to help me find a small place of my own, something modest and close by, a space where I could breathe without being observed. Her offer didn't feel like pity, it felt like an invitation to choose my own life. The following Monday, I went to the bank. I opened a new account, redirected my direct deposit, and removed my name from the automatic mortgage payments. It took time, but none of it felt rushed or uncertain. Each form I signed felt like a quiet declaration of independence. I didn't text my parents to explain. I didn't defend the decision. I no longer needed to. Later that afternoon I met my friend Beth at a cafe near the river. Beth had known me for years, though she'd never been deeply involved in my family issues. She listened without trying to solve anything. She told me I had spent years shrinking myself so others could take up more space. She said stepping away wasn't a lack of compassion, it was finally recognizing that the compassion had never gone both ways. She didn't tell me to forgive or to sever ties completely. She simply said I had the right to let the truth decide what happened next. Her steadiness was exactly enough. By the end of the week, I moved into a small apartment on a quiet street lined with old trees. The place was simple, the walls plain, but the stillness inside felt like a beginning. I set up a lamp near the window and watched the evening light drift softly across the room. I unpacked slowly, deciding where things belonged without asking anyone's opinion. The silence no longer felt like a wall, it felt like a doorway. 2 weeks passed, and a gentle rhythm formed. Work, home, simple meals, evening walks beneath the trees. The quiet had become familiar, earned, even. Then subtle signs began to appear, hints from the house I had left. None came directly at first. They reached me through people in town, bits of conversation, small remarks. A former coworker of Paula's mentioned she'd been struggling, lateness, missed deadlines, tense interactions with clients. Her hours were reduced. Nothing dramatic, but enough to affect her paycheck noticeably. When one pillar weakens, the rest of the structure feels it. Without my financial support and with Paula's income lower, the mortgage became harder for them to manage. I didn't ask for updates. I heard through the natural ripples of a small town that I continued with my life, watering the plants on my windowsill, going to work, making dinner. My peace remained untouched even as strain grew elsewhere. Then one evening my phone buzzed. A message from Mom. No greeting. Just, the bank called. Another payment is late. You know what this means. I read it several times, not out of confusion, but because I recognized the shape of the expectation woven into every word. Still no acknowledgement of how much I had carried. Still no curiosity about me. Just the assumption that my role had never changed. I didn't reply. I put the phone down. The silence stayed exactly where it belonged. The choice felt steady, not harsh. Some boundaries are built not from anger, but from the need to survive. More messages followed later that night. Mom wrote, "Your family is struggling and you abandoned us. Paula is drowning. Your father is worn out. You left when we needed you most." Her words tried to rewrite the past, turning years of sacrifice into neglect. The weight of responsibility was being placed neatly back onto the place where it had lived for so long that I didn't answer. And the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like a truth finally being protected. I now lived in a room whose door stayed locked, a space that only I could open. I no longer felt obligated to rush inside every time someone called my name. In the days that passed, neighbors told me that my parents had begun arguing more often. Small disagreements kept escalating into shouting. For years, their harmony had depended on my silence, on me absorbing the pressure so the cracks stayed hidden. Once I stepped out of that role, the imbalance became obvious. Someone had to take responsibility now, and they were not ready to share it. One afternoon, I came across my father at the grocery store. He didn't approach me. He stood in another aisle, staring blankly at the shelves as if trying to remember something he had once known but forgotten. His shoulders drooped in a way I had never noticed before. There was no anger on his face, only the bewilderment of a man watching something collapse that he had never bothered to inspect while it was still standing. I walked past him silently, and the space between us felt like a quiet line drawn with intention. Back at my apartment, I sat near the window where my plants had begun sprouting new leaves. The evening sunlight slid across the walls, soft and warm. Silence no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like a language I finally understood. Boundaries speak without raising their voice. They are calm, but they carry weight. Sometimes they say everything that needs to be said. A month passed, and the leaves along the streets outside my building shifted into deeper autumn colors. With the change of season came another disturbance from the home I had left behind. It started when my sister Paula, always good at shaping narratives to suit herself, posted a dramatic message online. In her version, I was the heartless sibling who had abandoned the family during a crisis. She used emotional words like betrayal and selfishness, adding photos of the house to make her story convincing. She did not mention the years I had paid the mortgage, the repairs, or the medical bills. She did not mention the sleepless nights I had spent calculating how to make my salary stretch while others avoided responsibility. Her story focused only on my absence, framed as cruelty. People reacted instantly. Some pitied her, others judged me. Neighbors, co-workers, and distant acquaintances, people who only knew fragments of the truth, began whispering. I noticed the glances when I walked to the market, the murmurs floating near me, gentle in tone but sharp in intention. They wondered how I could do something so cold. I didn't answer. Words spoken without understanding no longer held power over me. Silence became a shield I chose deliberately. During all this, I continued untangling myself from the responsibilities tied to my mother's home. I contacted every company connected to the bills. Some requests required long calls, others forms and signatures. Slowly, I removed my name from everything. Each confirmation created another quiet line separating what had once been expected of me from what I refused to carry anymore. When I finished the final task, the mortgage, I felt a lightness. Not joy. Just clarity. My mother tried to reach me through others when I stopped responding directly. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me in a tone that clearly wasn't their own. A former neighbor called to say my mother needed to talk to me urgently, speaking as though I had made some terrible mistake I should correct immediately. I didn't reply. I blocked numbers when necessary. Sometimes maintaining boundaries requires work. Every decision I made was calm and intentional. For years, I had responded to every emotional signal from my family as if my survival depended on it. Now I understood the truth. Stepping away was the only way to break the cycle. Through all of this, my friend Marlene, the one who first offered me a place to stay, remained steady. She never pushed me to confront my family or forced her own thoughts on me. She simply reminded me that my choices were mine. Sometimes we shared meals, sometimes we walked in silence. Her presence didn't direct me. It created space for me to exist without pressure, and that distinction meant more than I could express. Life in my apartment settled into a gentle rhythm. I worked, I rested, I cared for the plants that now had more leaves than ever. The outside world buzzed with rumors and shifting opinions, but none of that noise crossed the boundary of my home. Closing my door felt like sealing a space that belonged completely to me. My silence wasn't avoidance, it was a declaration. A quiet claim to my own life. The shape of my world had changed, and I was slowly learning to live in it without guilt or apology. 3 months later, the shift wasn't dramatic or loud. It was subtle, noticed only by those who were paying attention. Even so, the shift carried the full weight of everything that had quietly accumulated over the years. The house that had once represented stability for my parents was finally taken back by the bank once the last notice expired. There were no extensions, no second chances. Too many overdue balances had piled up for too long. My mother and father moved into a cramped rental unit a few miles away, a place people described as temporary even though no one knew how long they would stay. The rooms were smaller, the walls closer, and the air inside felt thick with tension that lingered regardless of silence. The change they faced was more than a relocation. It dismantled the illusion of permanence that had defined my entire childhood. Paula, my sister, who once spoke with unshakable confidence about handling everything on her own, eventually moved to a modest apartment after her situation became unsustainable. Her work hours had been cut because of performance issues, and the reduction in income forced her to abandon the lifestyle she once boasted about. Her tone around responsibility shifted from smug superiority to simmering bitterness. She complained to my mother about sacrifices she claimed she was making, even though the load she carried now was only a fraction of what I had managed for years. The cracks within their relationship widened with each passing week. Where they once found unity in criticizing me, they now redirected those accusations toward one another. Each of them believed the other should have done more. Neither confronted the decisions that brought them here. My mother turned her frustration outward, but this time I was no longer available to absorb it. Every message she sent, bundled with guilt, nostalgia, or obligation, went unanswered. My boundaries became a space I lived in, not something I had to justify repeatedly. My silence wasn't a punishment. It was the natural outcome of choosing my own well-being. My father, who had always avoided conflict by withdrawing into quiet, now found himself trapped in a home filled with unresolved blame. He had relied heavily on my financial support without ever acknowledging it, and now he sat in rooms where the absence of that support echoed louder than any argument. Meanwhile, my own life settled into a calm, grounded rhythm. I made my apartment into a home, not extravagant, but intentional. I woke early, worked steadily, cooked meals for myself, and allowed evenings to unfold peacefully. Without the constant emotional demands of my family, I began to notice small details again, the stretch of morning light across the floor, the shift in air before rain. For the first time, stability wasn't about holding everything together for everyone else. It was about having space to breathe. My finances, once tangled in obligations that were never mine alone, were now organized into savings, essentials, and plans that belonged solely to me. I began to understand the texture of my own energy when it wasn't consumed by cleaning up problems created by others. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just steady. Memories resurfaced occasionally, not as longing but as quiet reminders of the journey I had walked. Healing didn't arrive in a dramatic moment, it unfolded gradually, layer by layer, shaped by daily choices that honored my peace. I no longer felt the need to prove my worth to people who had refused to see it. I recognized it myself. There was no return to what once existed, and I didn't seek closure or reconciliation. Some distances must remain. Some stories end without final conversations or explanations. Not every ending needs an audience. I moved forward without looking back. When spring arrived, the light in my apartment entered softly, as if time itself had slowed enough for me to truly live rather than merely endure. My space was simple, pale walls, modest furniture, but there was a balance and quiet strength in it that I had never experienced. Each morning I woke without the heavy weight of expectation pressing on my chest. I prepared my coffee in silence, listening to the gentle hum of the neighborhood waking up. For the first time, silence was not an escape, it was home. I understood now that peace doesn't require grandeur, it only needs room. In the evenings, I spent time reading or walking through the nearby park where early spring flowers slowly unfolded. Their gradual blooming mirrored my own process of learning to live within myself. My days were no longer shaped by apologies, explanations, or rehearsed conversations that would never fix what had already broken. I no longer chased their approval or feared their disappointment. I had finally stepped out of the exhausting cycle of giving myself away in hopes of being acknowledged. On weekends, I visited the grocery store, choosing ingredients for meals that nourished instead of those rushed in exhaustion. I learned new dishes, cleaned my home with intention, and organized my money with care, recognizing the growing steadiness that came from planning for my own future. I began to see myself clearly, someone who had endured, adapted, and continued onward. Memories surfaced at times, but without bitterness. They arrived simply as reminders of a path that had shaped my clarity. I didn't hold anger, though I had once carried deep hurt. I carried understanding now, and that understanding allowed me to move freely without turning back. I came to accept that family is not defined solely by blood or shared history. It is defined by safety, willingness, reciprocity, and presence. Some ties unravel past the point of repair. Accepting that truth is not cruelty, it is maturity. I let silence remain where words had failed. I honored the version of myself who stayed loyal long after loyalty stopped being reciprocated. I chose to live with intention, not obligation. I chose stillness, and that stillness became strength. Freedom begins the moment we stop begging for love from places unwilling to offer it. Boundaries are not cruel, they are clarity. Choosing distance becomes necessary when closeness hurts. Not every loss is tragic. Some endings create space for a peace that cannot coexist with constant sacrifice. Healing is not forgetting, it is learning to live without returning to what once broke you. Thank you for walking with me through this story. Your presence matters more than you may realize. If you have navigated difficult family dynamics or struggled with creating boundaries, feel free to share your thoughts. Your experience might help someone still searching for their own peace. I'm grateful that you listened.